Chapter 66. Pagan Antinomianism. As we have noted, pagan religions had no moral law. The gods had privileges, and they resented pride on the part of man, but morality meant a restraint on divinity and was, for the Greco-Romans, alien to it. But society cannot exist without laws, and no matter how much man can be seen, in theory, as naturally good, in practice he is restrained by laws on the assumption of at least evil intentions. The state, therefore, of necessity had to have laws. Plato's Republic prescribed no laws, trusting in the wisdom and goodness of the philosopher kings. The disciples of Socrates and Plato became the tyrants of Greece, and Plato's ideal order was pederasty, according to Fight. Late in life, Plato did write the laws, but they were hardly more than expedient. Law came from the state, which was divine, as the case of Rome. In Rome, the ruler came to be called soter, or saviour. The Greeks had earlier conferred divine rank on Antigonus and Demetrius, and called them saviours also. Divinity gave rulers like Caligula and others freedom from morality and law because, as gods or potential gods, they were above and beyond the law. This belief is still with us. For example, the world of artists is one of disdain for morality because it is seen as the mark of the common herd. The Greco-Roman influence on Christianity was deep and wretched. In the Eastern or Orthodox churches, it means Platonism, and it leads to the ugly heresy of theosis. Salvation as deification, which means that the satanic temptation of Genesis 3:5 is made the way of salvation. In the West, Aristotle triumphed over Plato, and with Calvin, the uprooting of the Greek tradition began. Meanwhile, the Renaissance had revived classical ideas in Platonism. This influence was basic to the Enlightenment, and European culture was Hellenized. By the Victorian era, it had led to the 12-volume History of Greece by George Grote, 1846. Law is only incidentally referred to by Grote. The blind worship of things Greek in 19th century Europe is startling. Richard Jenkins observed that Homer was seen as the Bible of the Greeks. Amazingly, Gladstone was eager to make it, quote, the Bible of the English too, end quote. Other English scholars, writers, and others shared in the worship of things Greek. John Stuart Mill's devotion to Socrates was startling. In reviews by Grote, quote, he suddenly described Socrates as a sort of saviour, end quote. This adulation led more than a few to accept or to approve of male homosexuality because the Greeks had practiced it. The Victorian, quote, inverts, end quote, had the, quote, blend of moral earnestness and self-satisfaction which was typical of the age, end quote. The public school world was deeply infected by this influence, which is still there. E. Bradford tried to vindicate the practice in a poem, writing, quote, our yearning tenderness for boys like these has more in it of Christ than Socrates, end quote. Biblical scholar and Bishop B.F. Westcott actually held, quote, Plato is an unconscious prophet of the gospel. The life of Christ is the divine reality of which the myths were an instructive foreshadowing, end quote. The roots of this perspective are centuries deep. It has saturated Western civilization and the Church. I've heard churchmen argue that biblical religion is crude and primitive, whereas Greek thought was on a high intellectual level. The fact is that for the Greeks, ideas were ultimate, and because ideas are abstractions, thinking concerns itself with abstractions. Ultimacy in biblical faith resides in the triune and totally personal God. Thinking therefore seeks concreteness and particularity. Biblical thinking is marked by specificity, not abstraction. The Incarnation is a logical consequence of the biblical doctrine of God. The Islamic doctrine of God, while seemingly borrowed from the Bible, is very much the opposite. Islam holds God neither begets nor is begotten. This lends itself to mysticism, which arises wherever God is an abstraction. In the Church, mysticism has had Hellenic and Islamic roots. Given this vein of abstraction within Christendom, it is no wonder that Antinomianism came into its full flowering with the Victorian era, which had not only its worship of things Greek, but a growing interest in things Islamic, as witness Sir Richard Burton. An antinomian argument commonly heard is that the specificity of biblical law is crude and morally on a lower plane, whereas quote-unquote spirituality is superior. Quote, spiritual exercises, end quote, with many have taken the place of morality, and in quote, spiritual circles, end quote, much immorality is routinely tolerated if it is not public and hence embarrassing. Thus, for many, God's law occupies a lower plane, while they rise up into heavenly places with their spirituality and pious gush. The Greco-Roman Church Fathers found much in the Bible very objectionable because materialistic. St. Gregory of Nyssa spiritualized the law into symbolic nonsense. The influence of Musonius Rufus, a pagan Stoic philosopher, held that marriage should be allowed for sex only to procreate, otherwise it is, quote, unjust and unlawful when it is mere pleasure-seeking even in marriage, end quote. No intercourse when coming home from church or on Sunday. No remarriage after divorce, and so on and on. Such ideas were common to the spiritually minded pagans. Quote, the sophist of Abdena called sexual intercourse a, quote, minor epilepsy, end quote, and considered it an incurable disease, end quote. Marriage and law have at times both been seen as catering to the flesh, but then who can live in this world without the flesh? Who more badly or sadly than those who deny both? Is it a coincidence that the Church has seen a rise in immorality in its midst, even as it has embraced antinomianism? In the pre-Christian era, the great high priest was Simon the Just from the time of Ptolemy I. His favourite maxim was, quote, the world rests on three things, on the law, on divine service, and on charity, end quote. This was a concrete and practical emphasis, thoroughly biblical. Antinomianism, with its nebulous, quote, spiritual religion, is neither biblical nor Christian.